Jaya Radha. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gopi Janabalabha Girivardhari. Yasoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jaya Om Vishnupad, Paramhamsa Parvatakacharya, Tada Satashi Śrimad, Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki, Ananta Koti Vaishnavrinda Ki, Grantaraj Śrimad, Bhāgavatam Ki, Svāmī Bhaktivedanta Ki, Gaur Premanandi, all glories to assembled devotees, all glories to assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatirmirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshurmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupaka Damahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandehang Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragunatanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitam Cha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Dapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaur Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Prabhu Vishnu, could you rotate the camera counterclockwise, looking down on it? Not that way. Yeah, a little bit more. Okay, that's good. A little bit more, actually. I'll actually go back the other way. Yeah, that's good. Great. Right there, thanks. So, we are, as I understand it, on Canto 3, Chapter 17, text 28 and 29. 28 has no purport. So we will collectively recite 29, but I'll just read 28 myself. Tvam lokapalo dipatir brihatstrava virya pahodur madavira maninam vijitya loke kila daitya danavan yajraja suyena puraya jat prabho. And the translation to that verse is, you are the guardian of an entire sphere and a ruler of wide fame, having crushed the might of arrogant and conceited warriors, and having conquered all the Daityas and Danavas in the world. You once performed a Rajasuya sacrifice to the Lord. So I'll recite the English again. You are the guardian of an entire sphere and a ruler of wide fame, having crushed the might of arrogant and conceited warriors, and having conquered all the Daityas and Danavas in the world. You once performed a Rajasuya sacrifice to the Lord. Okay, so here is the verse that we will do collectively. Sa eva mupsikta madena vidvisha. Sa eva mutshikta madena vidvisha. Dridham pralabdho bhagavan apampati. Dridham pralabdho bhagavan apampati. Rosham samuttam samayan svayadiya. Rosham samuttam samayan svayadiya. Vyavochadango pasamam gatavayam. Vyavochadango pasamam gatavayam. Saeva muchikta madena vidvisha. Durdham pralabdho bhagavan apampati. Rosham samuttam samayan svayadiya. Vyavochadango pasamam gatavayam. Sa eva mutsikta madena vidvisha. Rurdham pralabdho bhagavan apampati. Rosham samuttam samayan svayadiya. Vyavochadango pasamam gatavayam. Sa eva musikta madena vidvisha. Durdham pralabdho bhagavan apampati. Rosham samuttam samayam svayadiya. Vyavochadango pasamam gatavayam. Saham Varuna. Evam, thus. Utshikta, puffed up. Madena, with vanity. Vidvisha, by the enemy. Drudham, deeply. Pralabdha, mocked. Bhagavan, worshipful. Apam, of the waters. Patihi, the Lord. Rosham, anger. Samuttam, sprung up. Shamayan, controlling. Svaya, diya, by his reason. Vyavochat, he replied. Anga, O dear one. Upashamam, desisting from warfare. Gataha, gone. Vayam, we. So the translation reads, thus mocked by an enemy whose vanity knew no bounds, the worshipful Lord of the waters waxed angry. But by dint of his reason, he managed to curb the anger that had sprung up in him and replied, O dear one, we have now desisted from warfare, having grown too old for combat. So, responsively, thus mocked by an enemy whose vanity knew no bounds, the worshipful Lord of the waters waxed angry. By dint of his reason, he managed to curb the anger that had sprung up in him. And he replied, O dear one, we have now desisted from warfare, having grown too old for combat. Sa eva mushikta madena vidvisha jurdham pralabdho bhagavan apampatihi rosham samuttam samayan svayadiya vyavochadango pasamam gatavayam. I forgot to read the purport because it's only one. I almost didn't see it. As we see, this is the purport of the verse by Srila Prabhupada. As we see, warmongering materialists always create fighting without reason. So, we've been discussing about the demoniac nature here. Generally, the Vedic literatures tell us about what the divine qualities should be and how to develop them. But there are sections in the Vedas where we find out about demoniac qualities, what they're like, and of course we understand implicitly that we should avoid them rather than trying to emulate them. And we have been cross-referencing with Bhagavad Gita's 16th chapter, which is a chapter entitled Divine and Demoniac Natures. And mostly, aside from the first verse, the 16th chapter describes the characteristic of demoniac persons. And demoniac nature and demoniac thought and demoniac action, they have a philosophy. So people who are demoniac in their way of thinking can explain what they're doing and what their purposes are in their mode of thinking through a philosophy. And so it is that philosophies govern the lives of everybody. People may have a very developed philosophy, or a person may have a very simplistic philosophy. A person can have a reasonable philosophy or an unreasonable philosophy. A person can have a philosophy that tallies with reality or one that's completely unhinged from reality. All those are possible. But the fact is that everybody has some kind of philosophy. There's some kind of method behind what they're doing. In our modern world, for the most part, most people have a very, very tiny philosophy, one that really isn't thought out very much, and usually just boils down to a couple of mottos, or maybe they could be called mission statements or something like that, and that's about the entire sum of their philosophy. There is a writing that was done by Bhaktivinoda Thakur called the Tattva Vivek, and in it, Bhaktivinoda Thakur gives us an overview of philosophies of planet Earth. And he starts off, interestingly enough, I'll read a little brief section from the very beginning to get a sense of what this is about. He writes verses and then he comments on them. So the first verse that he writes, I'll just read the translation. All glories to Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the nectarian form of everlasting knowledge and spiritual pleasure, by whose mercy this realization of the eternally existing, fully enlightened, blissful Supreme has been transcribed. Now this is verse 2. Koham va kim idam vishvam ayo ko nyavyo dhruvam atmanam nirvrito jiva prachati jnana siddhaye. What is this universe? This is a translation. What is this universe? Or who am I? What fixed relationship is there between us? In order to find the truth, the conditioned spirit soul, surrounded by matter, asks himself these questions. So it starts off, purport. The external world of sense objects is perceived by the senses. The objects are called Vishaya, and as the child matures, he becomes more and more aware of them. He becomes attracted to them. He tastes and because he tastes pleasure in contact with them. As such, he thinks and acts continuously so that he can experience this pleasure. He acts for nothing else. He becomes a constant companion of smell, taste, touch, form, and sound. And his mind thus becomes enslaved by them. When the idea arises, when death comes, I will no longer have any relationship with these external sense objects. When this thought manifests, he is fortunate. He turns away from the external world and the sense objects and strongly desires to know the absolute truth. At that time, he asks the above-mentioned three questions. Who am I, the perceiver of this external world? What is this external world? And just what is my relationship to it? So here's the next verse, verse 3. The self, due to variegated nature of his conditioning, gives many, many answers to these questions. The spirit soul, situated in his own original form and nature, indeed presents the true answer. So, Bhaktivinoda Thakur gives a long purport to that verse. But what he's laying out is that to the answer to these three questions, who am I, what is this universe, and what is my relationship, there are, as we see in the world, countless answers to this question. What am I, what is this world, and what is my relationship with it? But Bhaktivinoda Thakur makes two categorical chutes or bins that we can put everything in. One bin is we can put things into the bin of true answers, which is given by a soul that is in his constitutional position. And the other is all the other answers that were given by people who are not in their constitutional position of servants of the Lord, and their mind enlightened by true knowledge. So then later on, he begins to describe this idea that there are two basic categories of answers. One of them is, he says, he calls it astika. Astik is the Sanskrit word for it is so. So astika answers are Vedic answers, ones that are we assume the Vedas to be correct, and therefore such answers are called astikam. Now, answers that are by philosophies that attack the Vedas are called nastika answers. Na is not so. So we have two basic categories, Vedic and non-Vedic answers. Then Bhaktivinoda Thakur begins to talk about further, distinctions among what he calls materialistic and non-materialistic. So materialism he calls jadavad. Jada means stone, so it's the philosophy of the stone. Jadavad. So materialism comes in two flavors, and one of them is the flavor called, let me see if I can get to it here. Jadanandavad, and the other flavor is Jada Nirvanavad. So Jadanandavad is people who want to enjoy the material. So people who claim that from material, from matter, one can get enjoyment are Jadanandavadis, and those who are claiming that one has to detach himself completely from material, from matter, are, as he puts it here, Jada Nirvanavad, which is basically Buddhism. Jada Nirvanavad puts forward the idea that we cannot enjoy matter, which is kind of obvious in one sense, but there's no alternative and no. So what's the alternative to not enjoying matter? And according to at least traditional Buddhism, at least some flavors of traditional Buddhism, it's that one has to realize that you don't exist. So the answer to the three questions, what is this universe, who am I, and what is my relationship, is that you don't exist, the universe really doesn't exist, and there's no relationship. So this is Jada Nirvanavad. So the idea is to make everything zero, and that's why Prabhupada's pranam mantra says Nirvishesha Shunyavad. So Shunya is zero. So there are those who believe that everything is zero. And then we have the Jadanandavadis, those people who are in love with matter and that believe that one can enjoy matter. And this is primarily most of the philosophies on the planet. And people who are demoniac, we have in the 16th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, we have this idea that they're prideful, arrogant, deceitful, conceited. They have the desire to put other people down, because the main function of a person who is demoniac is to subjugate everybody else, to impress my will on everybody else's will. And this is the business of demoniac people. And this is exactly what our Hiranyaksha is doing. So he's come into contact with Varuna. Varuna is a very exalted demigod. He's the god of the waters. So Varuna has been approached by Hiranyaksha, and Hiranyaksha has glorified Varuna, but in a sarcastic way. So he's saying all these wonderful things about him, and his real intent is to anger Varuna so that that Varuna will fight him. But of course, the demigods are already cued in to the fact that Hiranyaksha is undefeatable, as his brother is, Hiranyakashipu, and that the only way that they will be defeated is by the Supreme Lord. So this is what Varuna will do, is just to suggest that as soon as possible, Hiranyaksha come in contact with the Supreme Lord, and the Supreme Lord will remove his pride and his life at the same time. So that's the information that Varuna gives. Of course, Varuna also says that I am too old to fight. So he disqualifies himself. And it's interesting here that we find that Varuna manages to control the anger that comes up by being challenged in this impudent way by this demon, Hiranyaksha. And this is the nature of those who are saintly, is that even when they can be provoked, or they're being provoked by somebody, they're able to control themselves. So this is what Varuna has done. In understanding philosophies, we recognize that materialism is actually two different things that are related but not exactly the same thing. From a philosophical point of view, from Western philosophy, materialism means that one believes that matter is all there is. That's one definition of materialism. And that's usually what is meant in Western philosophical circles when you say materialism. It means that one believes that matter is all there is. So in Western philosophy, there's the idea of monism. Prabhupada uses that word a lot. Monism means that there's one substance. What is that substance? It's either spirit or matter. And then if it's spirit, that means matter is a type of spirit. And if it's spirit, if it's matter, then it means spirit must be a type of matter. So that's what monism is. That's opposed to dualism, where you think there are two substances. So at any rate, this idea of materialism means that matter is ultimately the ground of everything. And any explanation must eventually wind up discussing how matter is formed to create whatever it is that we're discussing. But we understand that this is not a fact, that matter is not the ground of everything. The ground of everything is actually spirit. So in that sense, from a Western philosophical point of view, we are what would be called idealists. But it's more subtle than that, really. We're not really idealists. We understand that everything is formed from Krishna's energy, Parasya Shaktir Vividaya Shruyate. Everything is coming from some kind of energy of Krishna. We have the internal energy, which is Krishna's, Antaranga Shakti. We have the external energy, which is his Bahiranga Shakti, and we have the marginal energy, Tatastha Shakti, which is you and I. We are the Tatastha Shakti, or marginal energy. So that's how we understand it from a Vedic point of view. Now, back to the concept of materialism. Materialism has a second meaning, and usually it goes very well with the first meaning. And materialism means that matter is the goal of everything, that enjoying matter is what life is all about. And that is in harmony with what Bhaktivinoda Thakur calls Jadanandavad. So Jadananda means one appreciates matter as being the real purpose or the goal of everything, that enjoying matter is how we will enjoy. And as he says, the child grows up, from being a baby, and realizes that they're sense objects. He enjoys those sense objects. And from understanding how his parents and his peers and everybody in the world is acting, the child learns that enjoying these sense objects is basically what life is about. And there is no contradicting philosophy that he ever comes across, generally speaking, unless he meets one of those guys on the street, chants Haribol and hands him a book and asks him for a donation, guys or girls that are on the street. So that's the only way that he would have any clue that there's something other than the senses and the sense objects, and we're supposed to enjoy them. This is, of course, why people who are materialists will always come to some horrible situation. Because as we learn in the 16th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, that, okay, 16, there we go. They believe that to gratify the senses is the prime necessity of human civilization. Thus, until the end of life, Their anxiety is immeasurable, bound by a network of hundreds of thousands of desires and absorbed in lust and anger. They secure money by illegal means for sense gratification. So anyone who is basing their lives on material sense gratification is going to be absorbed in lust and anger, because whenever you make the senses the goal of your life, then collecting sense impressions is your main business. And you will be in competition with other people who are also collecting sense perceptions. You know, we want so many different kinds, like the Pokemon craze or something like that. We want, yeah, got to get them all, you know. So we are trying to see which possible version of sense gratification we haven't gotten. And if somebody else gets it before we do, we might have to wait, or we might have to lose out. So we're in competition. And somewhere along the line, we get the smoking more but enjoying it less principle kicks in, you know, that the more we try to enjoy a particular kind of sense gratification, we realize that it takes more to get to the same point, and eventually we start to realize that one category of sense gratification no longer cuts it for us. It's no longer the big, you know, rock'em sock'em, you know, knock your socks off kind of thing that it once was for us. So we move on. And usually we move on to darker forms of sense gratification, because that's the way the material world is set up, to move us on into darker forms of sense gratification. And this is unfortunate, because this is how people lose their lives, in the sense of wasting their lives. And there are a number of ways. Usually, I think there's some big favorites of ways people destroy their life. And probably intoxication is a good way to really destroy your life. One discovers that nothing really makes me that happy, but when I'm intoxicated, I don't care anymore. So intoxication is one way. The person goes down one particular rat hole into a life that's completely destroyed. Another one is by unfortunate romantic relationships. Another way that people generally can go down a rat hole into a life that's not worth living. Of course, there are people like, for instance, our Hiranyaksha, who want to compete and be able to conquer everybody. So through this competition and warfare, people usually at some point along the line, they meet somebody that's bigger than they are, and their life gets ruined that way. So through competition and warfare, one's life is ruined. And what else is there? Of course, sex life is, one of the most important ways people can ruin their lives, by engaging in unrestricted sex life, which always tangles people up into very unfortunate, humiliating, and degrading situations. So these are like booby traps hidden just inches underneath the soil for the unwary traveler of the material nature to kick up and blow their foot off. So this is what happens to people, because all they know is matter. They are, as we were talking about, Jadanandavadis, they are thinking that by enjoying matter, I will enjoy, and they've never heard any other philosophy. And so therefore, they're in one of these modes. Usually, people who are very serious about material sense gratification, then they are competing with others, and like Hiranyaksha, what they want to do is to get sense gratification and to subjugate everybody else in the process of getting their own sense gratification. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur goes on in Tattva Vivek, where he describes two forms of Jadanandavad, of thinking that material sense gratification is the goal of life. One of them he calls Nirsvarta Jadanandavad, and the other one is Svarta Jadanandavad. So Svarta Jadanandavad means to want sense gratification, and you don't care what it does to or for anybody else. So that's the people who are totally sold out to sense gratification. Nirsvarta Jadanandavad. What's that? Yeah, these are described in Tattva. It's all described in Tattva Vivek. It's an interesting book, if you can find a good copy of it. I'm not sure I would recommend this one. This one is a little bit dubious to me. It was done by someone that I used to know in the West Coast, by, what's his name here? He compiled it. What's that? Yeah, it might be a different version. Kailas Chandra, that's the person. And he was kind of a dubious person. At any rate, I don't want to get into that. But most of the Tattva Vivek is about Bhaktivinoda Thakur discussing Western philosophies and explaining how they stack up. And of course, if you spend any time looking at Western philosophies, you begin to realize, compared to Vedic philosophy, they really fall flat. Because they really aren't complete philosophies. I'm amazed at how, when you read about Western philosophies, they talk about how complete they are, but obviously they've never really come in contact with Vedic philosophy, or they wouldn't be saying that. But there's so many holes missing, and you take many of these philosophers, some of them just talk about one aspect, like Socrates. Basically, Socrates was just talking about morality. That was his main thing. Of course, Christianity, Jesus basically talks about morality. He doesn't really explain logic, or he doesn't explain epistemology, he doesn't explain other things. So that means when these other sections are missing, then we have to get them from somewhere else, So materialism is always going to leave us flat, and it's always going to create a group of people who are, as we were talking about last week, interested in unbeneficial, horrible works meant to destroy the world. So that's where we are now, and we can see how this is reaching a crescendo, unbeneficial, horrible works meant to destroy the world. There is a media personality named Chris Hedges who made the statement that we're now living in a country where, as he put it, the educational system destroys knowledge, doctors destroy health, lawyers destroy justice, the government destroys freedom, religion destroys morality, and the banking system destroys wealth. Well, no, this is, I'm quoting Chris Hedges here.
It sounds like you're quoting the 12 Canto.
It's something similar to that. But what's really interesting about this statement is that the group of people whose expertise is supposed to be a particular important thing in our world are destroying the very thing that they're supposed to be. Like it's saying that lawyers destroy justice. Lawyers are supposed to be the people who are helping create justice. The educational system destroys knowledge. Educational is supposed to be promoting knowledge, but instead it destroys it. That doctors destroy health. Doctors are supposed to be the people who are helping people with their health, but instead they're destroying it. So this is what's interesting about it. And that's kind of sums up Kali Yuga, that all good works are supplanted by false experts who are actually engineering the downfall of the very thing that they're supposed to be culturing. So that's the unfortunate part of Kali Yuga. So there's a lot more I could say, but I'm going to stop there because I want to give some time for questions and answers. Yeah, Matunga. Yeah, get the lay microphone.
I wanted to ask, there is a statement by Prabhupada, I think he was stating that Mayavadi is a covered atheism, or Buddhism is a covered Mayavadi. I think maybe something like that.
Yeah. Actually,
elaborate on this point.
Actually, according to the Vedas, anything but recognizing Krishna as a person, as a supreme, is atheism. If you think of the Brahman, or you think of, of these other types of, concepts, they're all various kinds of atheism. People who believe the universe is God, according to the Vedic philosophy, that's a kind of atheism. Most people think that it's a theism, and in one sense we could call it theism. It's just a matter of terminology, but there's so many different ways to miss the mark. As Bhaktivinoda Thakur is saying, that there's one answer given by the living entity who's in his original constitutional position, and a host of answers given by those who are not in their constitutional position. And those various other answers are all various flavors of wrong answer, or at least incomplete answers. Some of those answers can have parts of them that are indeed correct, but there's something missing, or at least some aspects of the answer that are incorrect. So those who think that there is, as I say, there is those who believe in just zero, and that's the Buddhist philosophy, and then those who believe that it's all one, which is the Mayavad philosophy, and then those who believe it's two, which is us. We believe that there is a supreme and the living entity, and we are simultaneously one with and different from the supreme. And the purpose of life is to serve the supreme. And that answer, actually, you can base a life around it, and you will not go down one of these rat holes that I was just describing, the rat hole of intoxication, the rat hole of, warfare and competition, the rat hole of, bad romance, or the rat hole of sex life, or one of these other kind of things, which is where most people's life goes off the rails and onto the reef, which is people don't know that they're wandering throughout this world, but there's so many trap doors, so many booby traps, and because they don't have any knowledge, eventually one of those trap doors, one of those booby traps will get them, and that's unfortunate. Other questions? Okay.
it appears that when we're outside speaking with people, especially trying to preach to them, that their minds are being influenced by these Western philosophies, which come from the days of Socrates and Aristotle and so forth. So many things are there that are basically engraved in the modern atheistic culture. So my question is it important for us as preachers to study these philosophies nicely so that we can defeat them?
Well, I don't think it's necessary for everybody to study those philosophies, but I think to some extent it really helps me to understand what the shortcomings are of these other philosophies, because oftentimes people will argue or present something. And oftentimes people in our Western world are unaware of where their ideas are coming from. We just grow up with them, they're out there in the everyday world. And what that means is that when you say some things, people will accept them without question. And when you say other things, you'll have to fight an uphill battle to get a person to accept that thing, So why is that? And the answer is, of course, that in Western philosophy, certain things have been kind of generally accepted by people for a long time. And so therefore, if you say them, most people won't, make any challenge to it. But most people have never considered the ramifications or the things that go downstream when you accept some of these things. As I've said, I think the first important thing to realize is, why is it that philosophy starts with the Greeks? At least whether you're growing up in, as far as I know, anywhere in the world, you'll study philosophy and it'll start with the Greeks. And the answer to that question, why it starts with the Greeks, is they were the first to present a naturalistic philosophy. And I've said, what is naturalism? Naturalism is the opposite of supernaturalism, which is, of course, that supernaturalism agrees that there are causative forces that are not matter, that are not what we know of as mundane nature. So at the time of the Greek philosophers, starting with the pre-Socratics like Thales and Heraclitus and Parmenides and these guys, during that time, the Greeks were worshiping demigods, just like people in India worship, and the Egyptians were worshiping demigods. But we put all these philosophies in the garbage can as far as Western thinking goes. All of them go in the garbage can. Why? Because the Greeks started by assuming that there aren't any demigods, there isn't any God, that we can build things up from fundamental matter. They are Jadanandavadis, they are building things up directly from matter and from logical consequences. So that's where Western philosophy starts. And once we talk about the Greeks, we go on, and people built on it. Of course, there was Christianity, which is certainly not a materialistic philosophy. But that's kind of an interlude, Western philosophy goes from the Greeks. We have the Christian era, and then on the other side of it, we have the post-Christian era, which is, all these other people. And that's why we have this atheistic culture that we live in now, because this, post-Christian philosophers did their best to debunk Christianity. And for most people, it worked, you know, and or at least people think it worked, until you kind of do a little bit of investigation. Then you realize that these arguments depend a lot on what you accept as your fundamentals. I've also made the statement that philosophy is kind of like a spectator sport, or some kind of, physical sport. You know, you have your rules of the game. If you're going to play philosophy, you have to have some rules. And then you're going to have your favorite teams and best strategies. And then you're going to have your sports equipment. You know, you're going to need those things. So philosophy is kind of like that. Depends on what the rules of the game are, how the game gets played, you know. So if you're going to talk philosophy, first, the person you're talking with, you have to decide what are the rules of the game, you know. This is why, as Bhaktivinoda Thakur says, there are so many answers to these questions, because people have different sets of what are the rules of the game. In the modern world, the minute you say something that is a supernatural cause, there are people who will say, well, okay, we're going to put that away because there are no supernatural causes. There's no proof that there's no such thing as supernatural causes, but there are certain people who will reject out of hand because you've mentioned a supernatural cause. So, which is, of course, the sum and substance of materialism, which is the sum and substance of atheism. As I said, I came up with this acronym for what I think are the very misleading aspects of our modern civilization, the most unfortunate trends, which I call rabid men squared, you know. So R stands for reductionism, A stands for atheism, B stands for behaviorism, I stands for impersonalism, D stands for determinism, and men squared, you have two versions of M. So you've got men is materialism and mechanism. E is epiphenomenalism, and I forgot what the other E is, and N is numericism and naturalism. So we have, these are the trends of modern thinking and modern philosophy that show that thinking has gone off the rails and into the ditch in some kind of way, you know. So reductionism, we reduce everything to matter. Atheism, there's no God. We can't talk about God. We can't talk about any kind of causes other than material causes. D, determinism, everything is determined by some material laws. So one of the most important features of the philosophy of West is that they believe absolutely in the laws. We don't believe in the laws. We believe in the lawgiver. So we see as primary the lawgiver. So if the lawgiver is primary, that means those laws can be changed, and sometimes they are. But if you believe in the laws, then you have to build a whole philosophy up from only the laws, and the laws can never change because that's all you have. So if you kind of understand these principles, you can understand why people say what they say, and you can also kind of come up with how to, at least people who are open, not everybody's open, but those that are open, you can figure out how to get them around their particular philosophy, materialistic, atheistic philosophy. All right. So unless someone else has a really pressing question, we're over time, so we should probably end. So thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Śrimad Bhāgavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.